Okay, so we're group 8, and our issue of justice was child labor. So the general issue of child labor, according to the International Labor Organization, is work that is mentally, physically, socially, or morally dangerous and harmful to the child and or interferes with their schooling, which deprives them of the opportunity to learn. So some causes of childhood labor is an unhealthy family life and economic deprivation, families struggling to support the financial costs of providing adequate care and nutrition to their children, and then families forcing their children to fulfill generational businesses or follow in prior family footsteps. Also, the belief that labor is character building and useful for skill development in children is another cause of child labor. As a result of these causes, children are frequently illiterate and uneducated, so they're unable to improve their lives later. So child labor takes on many forms. Hazardous child labor is work that is likely to harm the health, safety, or morals of children. It includes working in hazardous environments, dealing with hazardous substances, and or long hours of work that turn days of work into like night shifts. And then the worst forms of child labor is work in which children are separated from families, enslaved, and exposed to serious hazards and or illnesses. So some of these include all forms of slavery, childhood prostitution, and eliciting or offering children for illicit activities such as drug trafficking. Um, and then when combating child labor, the worst forms take priority over other forms.
Child labor is an issue of justice because child labor exploits young children who are either born into a certain family or do not have the means to gain an education. These companies who are profiting from the labor of young children are gaining exponential amounts of money while the kids are making little to nothing. Beyond that, kids are risking their lives and livelihood all to benefit a consumer or corporation. And then industries and companies that use child labor are doing nothing and gaining everything, and the children are doing everything and gaining nothing.
So for who is involved and how power is structured with child labor, so basically the entire world are stakeholders in child labor. There are 152 million children are victims worldwide, with almost half of child workers living in Africa and 41% living in Asia and the Pacific. So in areas where child labor is exploited, and those people who directly hold the power over children are in that kind of part of the world. Additionally, the reason as to why every person is affected in some way or another by child labor is because basically everyone lives in some sort of society and participates in some sort of consumer market. So brands such as Apple, Microsoft, H&M, Nestle, and British American Tobacco Company, just to name a few, they utilize child labor in some form or another. And even if you aren't focusing on if you are actively like trying to avoid brands that utilize child labor, companies such as Starbucks have contracts with Nestle. So if you go to Starbucks, you're actually participating in capitalizing on child labor in some sort form or another. Additionally, products such as gold, bricks, sugarcane, coffee, tobacco, cotton, diamond mining, agriculture, and even porn are common examples of industries in which child labor is used. So a lot of these examples are items that we see in everyday life, especially like sugar, coffee, tobacco, and cotton. So if you have any of these things in your everyday life, chances are you've interacted with child labor in some way or another. And on the other hand, how power is being used to minimize and eliminate child labor, there are 3 main international conventions, the ILO number 138, ILO Convention number 182, and then the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And what these do is basically outline the minimum age for admission to employment, and they concern the prohibition and immediate action for the elimination of the worst forms of child labor around the world. And additionally, these conventions frame the concept of child labor, and they form the basis for child labor legislation globally.
All right, so as mentioned, the tobacco industry is a large contributor to child labor around the world. So the first case study we chose to look at is the tobacco industry in Malawi, who has the highest incidence of child labor in Southern Africa. But specifically, tobacco makes up for about 70% of Malawi's foreign earnings. Attention was brought to Malawi in 1989 with the public gaining knowledge of sweatshops and child labor, and this promoted the first pushback against Malawi to treat their citizens in more humane ways. What was proposed was the Eliminating Child Labor and Tobacco Growing Foundation, which is a plan to protect the rights of children so that Malawi transitioned into hiring adults, or at least to pay the children a fair wage. But this was proposed by a tobacco company, the VAT, who relied on child labor, but they also left it up to the individual countries to decide what child labor was, so it wouldn't be the corporation's fault, which is a pattern we see with tobacco industries in Malawi specifically. Then in 2015, a reporter from the UN estimated that there were about 78,000 children working on these tobacco farms. The research conducted broke it down to say that about 40% of children of tobacco farm owners worked full-time or part-time. 45% of these children, I'm about a second to show that. 45% of these children are 10 to 14 years old, and then 55% of these children are 7 to 9 years old. But there's also assumed to be more children working than reported. There are laws in Malawi that responded to international pressures, such as the Employment Act, saying any child under 14 is considered to be working under child labor. And their constitution says that any child under 16 cannot work in hazardous conditions. And tobacco farms are considered to be hazardous for long hours, lacerations from equipment, chemicals, heavy lifting, extreme weather, and lack of food, water, and sanitation, according to the UN. And then the international pushback to the tobacco industry in Malawi, internally and externally, from NGOs and IGOs. NGO advocates push for the tenancy labor bill, which would improve health and safety conditions and also allow workers to unionize in the tobacco industry. And then the ILO also, at their convention for the worst forms of child labor and their safety and health and agricultural convention, pushed for amendments that would reduce hazardous labor in Malawi and urges countries not to allow anyone under 18 to perform hazardous work. But they also left it up to the individual governments to decide what was hazardous and what was child labor. So there was no change really seen in Malawi to this day.
So for the second case, I'll be talking about cotton production in Uzbekistan. So cotton is a very important product to the economy there. They are the 8th largest producer and the 11th largest exporter of cotton in the world. So in 2009, children were subject to coercive recruitment practices because their schools shut down during the cotton harvest, so that children would not go to school and instead were forced to pick cotton. So children as young as age 7 participated in this cotton harvest, and additionally, children who refused to participate were reportedly punished with expulsion from school or being held back, or even it was frequent to see them receiving bad grades in retaliation. Additionally, children who did participate in the cotton harvest were reportedly forced to sleep in makeshift accommodations in schools. They often slept on concrete floors and were given inadequate amounts of food. So in addition, children commonly were either not paid at all, or they were paid incredibly low wages for their hard work. So in Uzbekistan is a significant case because they actually were removed from lists of child labor and cotton production. And in 2018, the U.S. Department of Labor determined that child labor and cotton production was significantly reduced in Uzbekistan. And this is because in the 2017 harvest, only a small number of cases of child labor were reported and documented. And while people may think oh, this is flawed, this is actually unique because in previous years, upon receiving allegations of child labor, the government in Uzbekistan would make no effort. They would just throw the cases out. But in 2017, they did make efforts to investigate and remediate such cases. So the removal of child labor in the production of cotton in Uzbekistan is the result of targeted action, the collection and reporting of credible information, and the investment of resources. in the country. So this was not only done by the government, but it was also done by the with help from the ILO and under their international civil society groups. And while cotton production in Uzbekistan is a very specific example, it is an important example because it demonstrates that targeted attention and action can have a major positive impact on the lives of children and the elimination of child labor globally.
Next, we're going to talk about some violations that are not as severe as sweatshops and coercive tactics, but their child labor violations are also very prevalent in first world countries such as the US, and this is exemplified very well through fast food industries. Many fast food industry chains have been struggling to employ workers due to a labor shortage and high turnover rates. Because of this, some businesses have been making some questionable changes to keep their restaurants fully functional. One of those is Chipotle. In January of this year, 2020, Chipotle was fined nearly $1.4 million for child labor violations in Massachusetts. Massachusetts officials started an investigation after a parent filed a complaint saying that their child who worked at Chipotle worked several days in a row past midnight. According to the Attorney General's office, Chipotle routinely violated child labor laws between 2015 and 2019, estimating more than 13,000 violations across 50 locations in the state. According to the Attorney General's office, this was the largest child labor case in the state's history. And counsel at the National Employment Law Project stated, quote, "That's a pattern. That's not an occasional slip through the cracks." Some of these violations included forcing dozens of teenage employees to work more than 9 hours a day and more than 48 hours a week, and also work without a proper work permit. In addition, they were cited for breaching their paid sick leave protocols and failing to pay on time. Chipotle ultimately settled with the state and were ordered to pay close to $2 million. Part of the settlement included being ordered to pay $500,000 to train their young workers properly and to fund education programs about child labor. Now, aside from Chipotle, there are a few other fast food chains who have been fined for similar child labor violations in the last year. Qdoba, Wendy's, McDonald's, and Burger King have all been fined by the federal government for allowing minors to work outside of normal business hours and for other child labor related violations.
So the call to action against child labor, the main way to actually combat child labor, and more specifically the worst forms of it, comes down to actually legislation and government interaction. However, even when it's declared illegal, it continues to be tolerated and ignored because it has become an accepted part of certain cultures. So if we take matters into our own hands, there's ways you can donate, inform yourself, and raise awareness. So donating, you can go through organizations that work to raise money for legislation awareness for child labor throughout the global community. One specifically is called Humanium, and they actually partner with Hand in Hand in India for a cash transfer program. And through this program, it ensures that families receive financial support for their children each month. And then also through Humanium, you can donate in other ways by personally sponsoring a child. Also, to inform yourself, one of the most important things to do is become educated and not turn a blind eye to the issue. So first, some common misconceptions about child labor is the belief that there is nothing much that can be done to combat child labor because can only be resolved when poverty itself has been eliminated. And then child labor only exists because adults exploit children to make a quick profit. So some things you can do to raise awareness. There's actually a global World Day Against Child Labor, and that's June 12th. And there's also a global initiative called Keep the Pinwheel Moving. Through this initiative, they use the pinwheel as a symbol for the fight against child labor. The 5 blades of the pinwheel are representative of the different continents around the world. And then the wind spinning the pinwheel is the act to pass on the message and create awareness until all the countries take adequate measures to end child labor. And then you can also link up with others and communicate among the global community. And 12 to 12 is actually a community portal that shares awareness, raising ideas, and experiences of young people around the world. And then there's also all kinds of different campaigns and advocacies that you can kind of personalize to yourself to raise awareness. And one example is Music Against Child Labor, which is an initiative where organizations partner with celebrities, musicians, and other renowned conductors to raise money and bring awareness to the cause.
That's our presentation. I figure out how to stop sharing this.